It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Here's a question that's been hanging out there for years. Were state officials incompetent, negligent, or even complicit in the biggest fraud in Vermont history? The scandal led to three developers, Ariel Quiros, Bill Stenger, and William Kelly, going to jail for what prosecutors said was a Ponzi scheme involving hundreds of millions of dollars from overseas investors who backed a series of projects in the Northeast Kingdom. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company, State Auditor of Accounts Doug Hoffer outlines the findings in his office's 69-page report that does a deep dive into the state's oversight of the projects, including decisions and actions taken by Governor Peter Shumlin, officials in the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, which oversaw the EB-5 projects, and the Department of Financial Regulation, which was brought in later and helped unearth the massive misuse of funds. Hoffer says his office concluded state officials surely could have done more, but weren't corrupt as some investors have alleged. Instead, he says the state's role amounts to a tale of misplaced trust, unfortunate decision-making, lengthy delays, and missed opportunities. We'll hear from State Auditor Hoffer in a moment. First, a word from our sponsor. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. Let's start with something simple. What is the Vermont State Auditor's job?
Well, it includes a number of elements. We contract with an outside firm to do the state's annual financial audit, the audit of the state's financial statements. That same entity does the so-called federal single audit, which is a compliance audit, both very important, but not terribly exciting from my perspective as a policy guy, which leaves our office and our staff free to do performance auditing, which is basically all we do. And that includes reviewing programs and agencies and departments to see the extent to which they spend our taxpayer dollars in the way intended and they achieve the goals intended by the legislature.
In 2018, the former AG, T.J. Donovan, requested your office conduct an audit, review the actions of state officials, and address what he called, or I guess what you called, the loss of trust in state government as a result of the EB-5 program. So what was the scope of this audit, and what was not the scope of the audit?
Well, we didn't know at the time, and I can say I recall vividly the day that TJ called me, and then later I saw him at the press conference where he announced that. And I think you could see in his affect how happy he was to say, and here's Doug. Basically saying, I'm done with this. We've made our peace with it. We've done whatever we can do, which wasn't the case. There were subsequent other types of litigation. But we didn't know what it was. I didn't know what the goal was. I knew that there was fraud, a lot of allegations. At that time, the litigation was still developing, both the SEC and state. So I said, perhaps foolishly, sure, what the heck? But I did it because I felt pretty strongly that that's not really the AG's job, is to do the kind of work that we do. And I felt like Vermonters deserved to know the answer to the question, which wasn't the details of the fraud, which would be developed and come out in the course of investigations and litigation, but what was the role of the state? And that's where we ended up.
So your job did not involve any legal proceedings, criminal charges, etc.?
No, in fact, that's why we had to wait. After I agreed to take on this responsibility, shortly thereafter, litigation really hit full speed. And our professional standards, and this is commonplace for auditors around the country, if there is litigation or active investigations, you step back, let that process proceed, and when it's done, then you step back in and do your work, and that's what we did.
Let's talk about what you concluded here. So, what would you describe what's the bottom line, do you think, of your report?
Well, I think I can use a couple of phrases I came up with, which I think are fair. They may sound snarky, but that's not the point. We found a pattern of misplaced trust, and I'll get into some of these in detail if you care to. Unfortunate decision-making, lengthy delays, which were curious, and missed opportunities to prevent or minimize the damage.
Let's talk about the trust question. Where was the mistrust?
Well, I'm glad you started with that, because that really is the beginning of the story when the state decided to have its own EB-5 center, and this is the only state in the country, as many people who've been following this know. Typically, they're private. Here it was the state. So that means the imprimatur of the state is in and with that center, and that has great value conceptually to investors, as we'll get back to in a bit. But in this case, the Agency of Commerce, which was asked to host this EB-5 center, their business is to serve the business community. And, it's not a new idea that there's some concern in the community, as it were, about how can one entity be a promoter and a regulator at the same time. And you don't have to ascribe bad intention to people. We're just human beings. And if the purpose of this agency, for example, is generally to promote and assist and try to develop, relationships with businesses to achieve shared goals, then how good are they going to be about their regulatory responsibilities? Again, I'm not suggesting bad intent, but that's a common problem around the country. And I've seen a lot of it, some of it here in Vermont as well. So that was a problem right out of the gate. The structure of the arrangements were not ideal. And it's interesting because for two reasons. One, EB-5 was a very old program, been around for decades, and had a lot of problems at points along the way, fraud being one of them in the 90s, and they kept having to go back to the Congress, and Senator Leahy was a big proponent, so he was involved in all this, trying to fix it. But knowing that there had been those problems through the years should have tipped off the ACCD, Agency of Commerce officials, that we should at least give that some consideration as we develop the center and policies and procedures and so forth, and they really didn't. Second, the federal agency which oversaw this program nationally, and of course here in Vermont, USCIS, they really didn't ask the states or the private centers to focus on the securities and fraud issues. The securities issues for sure, because one of the things that the state did, and all the centers do, is to approve offerings. That's a term of art, but I think your listeners know what that is. And that's another tip. Oh yeah, offerings. These aren't just grants. This is a deal where people are paying, investing money. Of course, they weren't Vermonters, which I think had something to do with some choices along the way. So in any case, USCIS didn't require it, but that doesn't mean that the state couldn't have considered how they might recognize and adapt to that. And the second part of my answer, I'm sorry if this is a long one, is that we already had a great example of how to do this: captive insurance, which has two major elements. One is marketing, and the other is regulation. And those responsibilities are split. And there's a partnership between, as it turns out, the Agency of Commerce and the Department of Financial Regulation, formerly BISHCA, and now DFR. And so they knew there was a model for this, but they didn't go to that model. And I don't know whether DFR was ever asked to participate. I kind of doubt it. I think ACCD just said, oh, this is something we can do. This looks okay to us. It's not that big a deal. And USCIS didn't have a lot of requirements. But as I say, that's kind of a floor. That doesn't mean you can't do more. And that was a missed opportunity for sure. Long answer, sorry.
ACCD, Agency of Commerce and Community Development. So why do you think that they didn't do that? Or is that just a case now we consider with 20/20 hindsight and say they should have?
Because that's not generally what they do. They serve the business community. That's their charge. That's their mission. And they saw this as an opportunity to do that. And I'm not surprised. I'm not saying that they're bad people. But when presented with a program that looks so clean, oh my goodness, foreign money is going to go to places in Vermont that are hurting, like the Northeast Kingdom in this case. So what governor and what secretary of the agency wouldn't say, this is great, we can do this. And look, they don't ask much of us, and they didn't. That doesn't mean they shouldn't have considered what other things they could have done. That's my point.
All right, did you find any other examples of misplaced trust?
Yeah, one of the fellows involved, Bill Stenger, had been known to the Agency of Commerce and its partners around the state for many years. He was a well-known, successful guy, well respected. So I think it's pretty clear that he traded on that, and who wouldn't in his position? And in fact, the audit manager who was responsible for the report, which you've now read, did find evidence that even the secretaries, there were multiple of them over time, of the agency did feel like he was trying to trade on their relationships, which you're not supposed to do. I mean, that kind of gets rid of the arm's length independent, we wish you the best, Bill, but you can't count on me as a friend to make things happen for you. You've got to do your job. So that was a problem. But there were also, I think, opportunities where, for example, in early 2012, a gentleman not based here, I think he was from Florida, who had worked with the JPEAK folks, Kiros and Stenger and Bill Kelly, and helped them develop materials for offerings. He publicly stated, I don't trust these guys anymore. I'm out of here. And I think he may have been the whistleblower to the SEC. We don't know that for sure. But that should have gotten their attention, and it did. And the then secretary of the agency went to Bill Stenger and said, what's the deal? And Stenger said, don't believe a word of it. It's just a business dispute. Here's some records I can show you, blah, blah, blah. And the secretary accepted them. When in fact, and by the way, it wasn't just securities-related stuff. He also later said in a phone call, I think there's $13 million missing from their accounts. So fraud and security stuff should get the secretary or somebody in his or her position thinking, what should I do? What's the appropriate response? What does my due diligence say? And what happened, in fact, is that Stenger provided some materials to the secretary who said, it looks okay to me, and they just moved on. Well, those materials were handpicked by Stenger, and the secretary, although a very smart, I think it was a guy at the time and not a woman, very smart people, they're not accountants. They're not auditors. So I think that was a huge missed opportunity. Interestingly, around the same time, this other individual came forward with what is arguably a minor technical issue about the JPEAK folks using unlicensed brokers. Again, another hint. You should file that with the other guy and say, okay, securities. Should we have DFR come in and work with us on this? And they didn't. They asked DFR, not ACCD, but this complaint or this allegation went to DFR, which said, well, we're gathering some information, but that's the last anybody ever heard of it. And by the way, as my audit manager reminds me, just because she didn't find in this enormous volume of records anything else after that point about that particular issue doesn't mean there was wrongdoing. It just means it was over 10 years ago, and who knows what happens to all the records. So I want people to know that. So those were important missed opportunities because that was so early in the game. And at that time, by the way, they were still within recent sight of the original agreements developed between the center and the JPEAK projects. Each one had a memorandum of understanding about their mutual responsibilities. This MOU did not include a requirement for an audit, which makes no sense whatsoever. And as it turns out, my audit manager informed me that what happened is that at the very beginning, when they set up the center, somebody obtained from USCIS at the federal level a model MOU, and the state just used it. And, you can't blame them for saying, well, we got a model here. We don't have to do any work. That's one. Two, we know they're going to accept it. Let's get to work. Let's promote jobs and do the thing. Well, that model MOU didn't include the audit provision. And they could have done that at the very outset if they had asked for it or insisted on it. Who knows how they would have had to negotiate, but it wasn't there. And later, when things started to get squirrely, not serious enough to shut it all down, but squirrely, JPEAK, I think Stenger, came to the state and said, we want you to update the MOUs for Burke Mountain and for ANC Bio. And the state said, well, okay. That was their opportunity for the second time to insert audit provisions, and they did not. That was a huge mistake, in my opinion. I don't know why they didn't do that, but they didn't.
One of the controversial parts of this that I recall was that at one point they were claiming, the state was at least implying, I think actually they were stating that these projects, telling the investors that these projects were being audited, and trotted out the governor and had him do this video where he claimed that to be the case.
Actually, it's even more interesting than that. The state never told anybody that we collectively, the state, not my office, were auditing the projects. Stenger convinced the governor, Governor Shumlin, fact, to be videotaped and to do a little bit that was used as part of a video that they used to promote around the world. And the governor did say foolishly and mistakenly, as we know, that, yeah, all these projects are audited by the state. Well, first of all, what did he mean by audited, which is a question in and of itself, and why did he do that? Well, who knows? I'm sure he thought he was helping. Interestingly, the state didn't know about it for a long time, and which is a problem related to something we can talk about later, which is the lack of documentation on the state side. Had they reported that to the ACCD would have said immediately what they said many, many months later, which is, what the heck are you talking about? The state doesn't audit these projects. Eventually, when the state learned of it, the center and ACCD, they said, whoa, you have to stop doing that. Unfortunately, that's when things got a little confusing. Talk about trust. They never asked JP specifically to take it off their website, even though they told them, this is incorrect, this is false, you shouldn't do this. Nor did the state itself go onto the center's website and say, by the way, if you ever see that video, be aware that there's a false statement in there about auditing. And the secretary at the time said, I don't think that would be effective. Well, first of all, it's virtually free to put something on a website, and what have you got to lose? And second, what do you mean it wouldn't be effective? It would be very direct, because people went to the center website, among other places. So that was that. And then the secretary also said, I don't think it's necessary for us to require them to send notices to potential investors about this. So what started out probably as an innocent mistake by the governor, because ACCD and the attorneys in the governor's office said, we never asked him to say that. Stanger asked him to say that or encouraged him. I don't know I wasn't there. But I'm guessing it was just something he thought would be helpful. You know.
How is it that the Agency of Commerce and Community Development promoting the project could have taken so long to figure out that video, that promotional video, included the word audit? That seems incredible.
Well, it suggests rather directly that they were not staying on top of watching everything that was coming out of the projects. Now, admittedly, that were all over the world. They were in, Vietnam and China and Taiwan and so forth and so on. And that's a lot of ground to cover. On the other hand, we get back to the question of what is your responsibility? You're happy, you being the state and the agency, you're happy to believe that this is going to create jobs and be good for Vermont, but there's also risk. There's always risk, and not just because of the securities thing, but primarily because of fraud. So what are you going to do to make sure, if not make sure, then to lessen and mitigate the risk? And the fact is, there's a lot of things they could have done and should have done that they didn't, and that's what this is about, frankly.
You talk about this being a tale of misplaced trust, unfortunate decision-making, lengthy delays, missed opportunities. We talked about the misplaced trust. What were the unfortunate decisions? Well,
that bled into the question about audits. Again, I have no reason to think that the secretary of the agency at the time didn't make a decision that he thought was justified, and I didn't tell you why. And the record suggests that he or she, whomever it was at the time, there were two instances, did not believe that the state had the authority to insist on an audit in the MOU, in the Memorandum of Understanding, which makes it so bizarre and unfortunate that when they had a chance to revise the MOU, when JPEAK itself was asking them to do that, they had leverage, and they didn't use it. I happen to think, having read the language of the MOU, that there really was some space to wiggle in there. And while obviously JPEAK and those folks would have said, you don't have the authority, and they would have had to fight about it, in retrospect, it might have been a justifiable and appropriate fight to have. And also, by the way, back to why didn't they know about, the video with the governor? There was a requirement in the MOU that they have quarterly meetings. Sounds reasonable. But the record keeping was terrible. There is some evidence that suggests they had meetings, but not exactly when, not exactly what was discussed, and no records of those meetings were kept. Now, that's just poor. Now, it may be that the players who were involved from the agency and the center and so forth on our side, the state side, were satisfied that what they were hearing from and records being shared with them at the meetings were satisfactory. and seemed to say, this is a good project. Things are moving along. Look, I can see a tractor. There's a pile of lumber and stuff's happening. On the other hand, the things that were shown to them were never given to them to take away. They were spreadsheets and stuff, very informal. And of course, as was admitted by the director of the center at one point, he said, I didn't read the financial stuff. I'm not an auditor. So the point is, we're back to the trust thing and the lack of records. They're all rolled together. But I'm not surprised they didn't know about the video, because they didn't insist that the JPEG folks provide regular updates on what's going out in writing on the web and so forth. Had they seen that, they would have saved a lot of time.
What I'm hearing you say is a lot of incompetence as opposed to negligence. And I guess I would define incompetence can be passive and negligence can be active. Did you find cases of intentional negligence?
Absolutely not. And I'm not even sure I would use the word incompetence. That's a strong word. Negligence is a legal term, and I certainly won't go into those waters. But no, I saw no evidence of corruption. I know there's a lot of people who, because of the magnitude of this thing and how unusual it is in Vermont, well, there must have been people on the take and all this sort of thing. We saw no evidence of that whatsoever, honestly. And I'm glad to say that. That doesn't mean I like the outcome, but, people were doing their job as they understood it. They didn't ask themselves and each other enough or the right questions.
Okay, well, but why would that not be incompetence?
That's not for me to say. That's a judgment.
All right, the U.S. Attorney's Office characterized this case as one of greed, glory, and desperation, referring to Bill Stenger, Bill Kelly, Ariel Quiros, who were ultimately convicted in fraud-related charges and went to jail. And they clearly intentionally misled. I mean, you even say that they intentionally misled investors. Do you think state officials intentionally misled investors?
No, I don't think we would have the evidence to say that. No, not intentionally. I think, as I've said, they could have done more to make themselves aware of all the things that were happening on the other side of the screen, on the JPEG side. They were trustworthy. They chose on a couple of occasions not to use what authority I think they had, but they were questionable about. Here's another example. At one point, to their credit, the general counsel of the Agency of Commerce at that time, I think he's still there, was concerned about securities issues. He actually did think that they needed some assistance from the outside because ACCD itself doesn't have that expertise in-house. Interestingly, he didn't go to DFR, but he went to the Attorney General and said, can you help us, dig through this and figure it out? And months and months and months went by. 13 months went by before, I guess in the interim, the Attorney General's office had said something to the effect that we don't have that expertise. You can go outside and get it if you need it. 13 months later, the Secretary of the agency authorized the General Counsel to go out and get that assistance. 13 months. It was another 7 months before the contract was developed, somebody was hired, and they had their first meeting. 20 months went by from, to his credit, the first acknowledgement that the attorney needed help within the agency. That was the right thing to do, to ask, hey, I need some help on this. That was good. 20 months. So, there were people who made choices. I mean, we don't have evidence for everything. Lots of this was done over phone calls and in meetings and people talking. So there's a lot that we don't know. But that seems curious to me.
Okay, if you're not willing to use the word incompetence or negligence, how would you describe the actions of state officials in the course of this project, these 8 projects?
I'll go back to the beginning. A pattern of misplaced trust, unfortunate decision-making, lengthy delays, and missed opportunities. I don't know how else to put it. It's not my place to be judgmental about intent or their capabilities as professionals. I think in some cases, there were a lot of lies on the other side of the table. They were fed a steady diet of lies. And
from the developers.
Yes, exactly. And that's where it gets a little challenging for members of the administration at the time, and there were multiple administrations, because they had a relationship with Stenger. So my guess is, and this, again, back to the fact that we're just humans, having known the guy for so long and had good relations with him and succeeded in various projects, they were probably a little reluctant to entertain the idea that he was lying and part of a fraud.
Not only Stenger, but at least in the case of the governor, Governor Shumlin, he developed a relationship with Ariel Quiros, who's really the lead developer on this, serving the largest jail sentence, a relationship that even resulted in the governor using Quiros' apartment in New York. They had a private meeting. Was that improper?
It seems like bad judgment, at the very least, for sure.
Okay. Did you get into that in your report?
No, I wouldn't consider his use of his apartment related to the monitoring and oversight of the EB-5 projects.
At one point, you do talk about there was a kind of a key decision at one point when a lot of these red flags were going up, and the projects towards the end here, really the last two, the ANC Bio project, which I guess I'd call project number 7, and the Burke Mountain Resort, which is project 8 of 8, and this decision about whether or not to allow continued investments in it. And there was a disagreement between the Department of Financial Regulation and Governor Shumlin about how to proceed. The governor really didn't want any restraints put on. The Department of Financial Regulation wanted this money to be put into escrow. What did you find and conclude in that disagreement?
Yeah, that is a very interesting moment in time. And again, I understand why the parties took the positions they did. First of all, with regard to ANC Bio, everybody knew, except for all those elected officials who went to the ribbon cutting, who should have known better, in my opinion, that something was really wrong with the ANC Bio project. Who really thinks that a biotech firm is going to find the labor they need and the money they need in Newport? Newport's a lovely town. The lake is gorgeous. The country up there is fantastic. But a world-class... Anyway... what happened is DFI, and by the way, for the record, people should be aware that the Department of Financial Regulation, when they were finally brought in, and ACCD had acknowledged that they didn't have the legal authority or the skill, they said, we need help. They should have done that years prior, but when they did, and DFR came in, they did a really good job. The pace picked up, their desire to and ability to call the question with the developers was spot on. They did the job. They got it. That's why we're having this conversation. So I just want to give them a shout out. But the ANC Bio thing, DFR understood that, we can't be sure that how they're going to use this money. This is not like Burke Mountain or Jay Peak, where there's obviously already assets and they're going to expand on them and so forth. There's nothing there. And it's based in part on a relationship with a really odd sounding company in Korea. And who knows what any of this means. So that's when DFR said, yes, there has to be an escrow account, and no money will go out from this account until we approve it. And they initially weren't thinking about Burke, but then they realized we should probably do that with them as well. And that's when heads started butting, because there was work going on. A lot of contractors were involved that were expending their own funds in anticipation of getting paid for their work, when in fact they weren't getting paid for their work, not at the pace they should have or in full. And there were a lot of jobs at risk and so forth. And, also Jay Peak understood it had leverage and threatened on more than one occasion to shut it down if the state didn't, move as they had hoped. So the governor's office was hearing from everywhere, from citizens, from legislators, from contractors, let this program continue because the jobs are important. And also we have records from conversations within the administration, including the governor's attorney and others, at least we'll have an asset. If at the end this goes to a receiver or bankruptcy, we'll have something to hold on to, a finished product, which was perfectly reasonable in theory. On the other hand, it led to some bizarre results. For example, the people, and there were many of them, who invested in the ANC Bio project, no money went out for construction or development of any kind. So there were no jobs created as a result of that. And therefore, those people could not get green cards. they got most of their money back, curiously, but they didn't get green cards. The feds allowed them to transfer their investments to other projects in New York State, so some of them, I think, succeeded. But in Burke Mountain, their money did go, in fact, to build the facility, but the feds got a little annoyed at everything that was happening and said, we're going to shut this down. We're not giving you green cards. This is a mess. You, state of Vermont, you didn't run your center properly. You didn't ensure things got done in a timely and proper way. So everybody's out. And in fact, the people who are most screwed by all of this are the investors in Burke Mountain, who put up, I think, $61 million, and almost none of them have green cards. And we don't know yet. The state is working as part of the settlement agreement. The state is working with all the parties to try to help them get their green cards, but we don't know.
By selling Burke Mountain?
In part, yes. Yeah.
You also wrote about that the ANC bio investors, some of them got their money back because the money had been raised and none of, as you point out, there'd been no construction done. So why is it, I mean, I think you and others have said this project just conceptually made no sense. So why is it that you and other people saw that? Were you able to determine why no one in an official capacity was able to come to that same seemingly obvious conclusion that this was pie in the sky?
I can only guess that elected officials who were looking at an area like the Northeast Kingdom, which never gets all the economic development opportunities that Chittenden County and Central Vermont in many cases gets. Somebody comes along and says, boy, we got a deal for you. And it doesn't appear that there's any cost to the state. It's all foreign investors. And I don't think they thought it through. They said, this is fantastic. We can't believe. And obviously there was a record because work was done at Jay Peak. Things happened. Not all the things they promised, which some people aren't aware of. They're minor things that they didn't build the bowling alley. They didn't build as many fancy suites as they promised. But in general, if you looked at it from some distance, well, this seems to have worked. So the same guys came along and said, this is even better. Get ready. And, had I been, who knows, but had I been one of those guys, I might not have gone to the ribbon cutting. Because as a guy who had worked in economic development policy for many, many years, when they announced this, I went, what? What are you talking about? The airport's not even big enough for a private jet, let alone something to bring in people from all over the world. So I don't know. To answer your question, I have no idea why they fell for it, except that they wanted to believe in what appeared to be a good project for the area.
Tell people your background in economic development.
Well, I went to law school because I thought it would be good preparation to do policy work, much more interesting to me than just doing a graduate program somewhere. So I came to Burlington 35 years ago to work in City Hall in Burlington when Bernie was still mayor on the way out. And, they created CEDO, which people I think know about, Community and Economic Development Office, which was a great opportunity. There were interesting things being done at that time, both in Burlington and around the state. So that was a fun introduction. And then I spent 19 years, after 5 years in City Hall, 19 years, just as a policy analyst, sole proprietor in business. So that's how I spent most of my professional life until I took this job.
The federal government, the U.S. Attorney's Office, has not ever charged any state officials. Investors in this did file a suit where they claimed that state officials had not only acted improperly, but had been negligent and had acted improperly. The state of Vermont, through the Attorney General's office, which this has always been a little unclear to me that they represent state officials. I guess they're also supposed to be representing the general public too, but I'm not entirely clear on that. But the state agreed to pay $16.5 million as part of a settlement with the investors. It also included language that said that state officials did not engage in fraud, self-dealing, or other intentional misconduct. Would you say that's a fair conclusion after conducting your audit?
Well, the legal requirements to get to fraud, I don't practice law, and it's been 35 years since I was in law school, and that's what the Attorney General's staff is paid to do. But I will say that in the evidence reported to me by the audit manager who went through the tens of thousands of documents, we found no evidence of fraud by state officials. I wanted to make that clear at the outset, and I'm happy to repeat it here. As for negligence, that also has criteria in law, and I'm not here to report on that. I can't opine about legal matters. That's not my job. I'm not surprised that that language was in the settlement agreement, because that's what the state was after in the end, not only to avoid a bigger hit if they had gone to trial in terms of dollars, but also for the record to say, look, whatever you think went on, we were not, we did not act fraudulently. We did not act intentionally. And I think they're satisfied because they settled for a number which sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but given all that came before the settlement, would you have wanted to roll the dice on a jury trial?
Well, I guess I'm going to ask you the same question. Should the state of Vermont have settled for $16.5 million if, as you found, really this was a case of, as you describe it, misplaced trust, unfortunate decision-making, lengthy delays, and missed opportunities? Did we just squander $16.5 million?
I think it's not uncommon for attorneys to make their own judgments about the risk of going forward. And if you have a jury and they feel, as many people in Vermont do, like, we got cheated. Well, what does it mean that we got cheated? The investors got cheated. The state of Vermont, there were some costs in the process, but not at all like the investors themselves. Was it a mess? Would we all rather have not had to deal with this for the last 10 years? Of course. But that frame of mind, I think, is not uncommon out in the world in Vermont. There are people who are thinking, unfortunately, that the state did act fraudulently and perhaps in matters that are corrupt. We found no evidence of that, thank goodness.
You mentioned earlier that you thought the Department of Financial Regulation did a good job in this once they got involved. There were, though, disagreements within the Department of Financial Regulation when it came to allowing more investors to come in at the end here, particularly with ANC Bio and the Burke Mountain project. And in fact, my recollection is that the deputy commissioner, Mike Pichek, who's now the state treasurer, and it's probably not relevant for our discussion, but is clearly somebody who's looking to get into higher office, disagreed with his boss, Susan Donegan, and didn't feel that it was appropriate to allow more investors come in. Taking aside the politics in here, does that support or undermine your argument that DFR did a good job, quote unquote?
Well, in the end, any commissioner, and that's what Susan Donegan was at the time, reports directly to the governor. And we know that there was a lot of discussion within DFR about the extent to which Burke Mountain should be allowed to continue or not, or if there was going to be escrow, how it was going to be handled. In the end, the money was only released after a third party determined with some certainty that the money was only going to go for construction purposes. But I don't think it's fair to say that one took a position that the other opposed. I think they both understood. This is to say, Mike and Susan, they both understood what the situation was. Ultimately, I think the decision was made primarily by the governor's office about, what can we accomplish here if we go down path A as opposed to path B. And as I said before, there was a lot of support for letting the project continue so that the contractors could get paid and therefore pay their workers, and that we would end up with a Burke Mountain Resort facility. And you can argue both sides of this, whereas DFR, there were some in DFR who were saying, come on, we can't trust these guys. So in the end, they came up with this method of ensuring that the escrowed money would only be used for construction, which is a kind of a fair middle ground.
Well, and to be fair, Susan Donegan did ultimately insist on putting the money into escrow and threatened to resign unless that happened, which it ultimately did.
Right. Yes.
What do you think your report has added to what we know?
Well, I would hope that for those, as I said before, who are of the opinion that the state was complicit at some level, that we've provided sufficient information to say that's not the case. And we've seen every piece of paper, virtual or otherwise, that is related to this issue, all of it, even the attorney-client stuff, most of which I think was already made public. Excuse me. So I'm happy that that's the case. It's not uncommon in my office that we issue reports that basically describe how state government isn't achieving as much as it should in its administration of a program here or there, and then we hope that they will improve based on our recommendations. Here, this was such a screwy thing from the beginning. I mean, a lot of people are uncomfortable, including me, with the idea of foreign nationals buying green cards. It's just weird. So I'm uncomfortable with the program, but that has nothing to do with the work we did here. This was just reviewing the available evidence, which was massive. But what does it say to people? Hopefully it tells them what I've told you, that I don't believe the state, as the language in the settlement asserts, was fraudulent in its activities or intentionally caused or was complicit in any illegal activity. Did they administer the program as effectively as they could have? No, clearly not, in my opinion. And decisions made at the very outset had a lot to do with that. So I hope, in fact, that's a takeaway for sure for me. This is not the only instance in state government where we have entities, big agencies and departments that have dual responsibilities that are sometimes in conflict. And again, as I said at the very outset, that doesn't make them bad people. It makes it a very challenging mission to promote and regulate at the same time. You see some of that in the Agency of Agriculture, for example. You see some of that in the Agency of Natural Resources. You certainly see that in the Agency of Commerce every day. So I would hope that the legislature, for its part, would, when they get the time, which is almost never, revisit this issue.
One of the requests that was made of you is to conduct this audit in the hopes that it would restore trust in state government. Do you think it does restore trust in state government?
Well, as I said, ACCD eventually understood that it did not have the legal authority or the skill sets necessary to deal with the problem. So they turned to DFR, which is what they should have done earlier, but they did it. And to their credit, DFR did its job. So, there are some good takeaways. When the state, I think, began to really accept the fact and not be in denial about what was going on here, they didn't walk away from it. They didn't try to hide from it. They said, man, we really got to take this seriously. Let's get on this. And they brought DFR in. And I'm not talking about Mickey Mouse with a cape here, but, they got the job done. And now, admittedly, the SEC had a lot to do with this. And it's kind of interesting that nationally, this program and the oversight at the federal level did not take the securities part of this seriously for many, many years. So it's not just Vermont. I just hold these folks to a higher standard. If we're going to develop a center with the state's name on it, then I would have hoped that they would have taken a broader view of this from the outset. And they would say, oh, how do you can't say that, 20/20 hindsight, and so forth.
I don't think you actually meant Mickey Mouse. I think you meant Mighty Mouse.
Excuse me, yeah. Mickey didn't wear a cape, but Mighty Mouse, yeah.
You mentioned this earlier, and I thought this was one of the more interesting takeaways from the audit. I think most people out there think that the ANC Bio investors, the ANC Bio project was termed a complete fraud, would be the people that were most negatively affected. And that is just not the case.
No, that's true. As we discussed before, the ANC Bio investors were made whole financially. Many of them didn't get green cards, but many of them are in the process of getting green cards. They did pretty well, considering that, as the judge said in his decision, Judge Crawford, that the project was a ghost. There was just nothing there.
So in the end of this, and your report is really the first time that I've seen laid out how many investors got their money back, what the percentage were of investors that actually got green cards. I mean, the bottom line here is that we had 854 foreign investors who collectively invested or paid $427 million to the developers. And so can you share with us, what's the bottom line here in terms of investor success or failure?
Well, I think obviously the investors are not a monolith. They all had different circumstances and came in for different reasons. But to the extent that the green card was the ultimate goal or the primary goal, then a lot of people didn't get what they were after. The people who invested in the first projects, that were primarily at Jay Peak, at the resort itself, they did okay. They didn't all get their money back, but many of them got green cards. The people who invested in Burke Mountain are really shafted. Not because there wasn't work done and jobs created in truth and on paper using the model, but because the federal government is not yet allowing that to go forward, and there's no money yet. The receiver has done a pretty interesting job of generating revenue from lawsuits and settlements and so forth, but Burke is kind of hanging out there, and I'm guessing whatever he sells it for ultimately is not going to be sufficient to satisfy all those investors. And there were a lot of them. 121 people, families, invested $500,000 apiece in Burke. And I'm guessing that there's not going to be enough money to make them whole. And unless the federal government changes its position and the state works in that direction to get them to start thinking seriously about green cards, then those people are screwed.
But why wouldn't they at least get their green cards, given that, as you talked about earlier, there was construction going on, jobs were being created?
True, but the feds have told the state, you may recall that part about the feds, I know you do, telling us to shut the center down, that we were no longer actively or effectively promoting economic development and job creation, and that we didn't deserve to run a center anymore, and the state appealed. And eventually, after a lot of back and forth, the feds allowed us to keep it open so that we could help the other EB-5 projects in Vermont, there are 4 or 5 others, cycle through and shut down eventually, and that's what they're doing. The center doesn't do much anymore. It's not taking on any more new projects. But the feds were in this, yes, thank you. The feds were in this curious place of saying, you didn't get it right. And while we're in our odd, confused place, how can we possibly give people green cards with all this uncertainty and fraud and litigation and so forth? Now that the case is settled, I would hope the feds would revisit the question and consider the plight of those investors who, to date, haven't gotten their green cards.
What's going to happen with this report? What happens now that you're done? Does it go to what happens with the report now?
It'll go on our website, along with a full page with access to a lot of documents for people who might be interested in digging a little further. Depositions, materials submitted to the court by both parties for a variety of reasons. So that's that. Beyond that, to answer your question, the same thing that happens with all of our reports. We present these things to people. In this case, there are no recommendations, which is unlike our normal audit reports. But there are some lessons to be learned from this, as I mentioned before, about state agencies having conflicted missions. That's what I hope is the big takeaway, because EB-5 is done. There's nothing more to be done about it by the state. The green card issue and the money is all about the receiver and the USCIS. The state has the state can assist in that process, but that's it. So we're done. But I'd like to think that this information will help avoid this kind of thing happening again.
Okay, because let's be honest. I mean, an awful lot of your reports in the past have basically gone on a shelf. The Attorney General has been clear in her testimony recently to the legislature that she hopes that this is, when she presented the settlement to lawmakers, I hope this is the last we have to hear about the EB-5 program. So many people just seem to want to have this go away. So why not include recommendations in this report to recommend things that you mentioned earlier, like the Agency of Agriculture, other places where there are these potential dual roles which are not appropriate of promotion and regulation?
Well, if I'm asked to testify in any of the committees of jurisdiction, I will say just that. Also, as I mentioned to you, we will be producing and distributing a newsletter, as we do at the issuance of almost every report from our office, and that may well include informal comments, suggestions, but not formal recommendations.
Okay, so what's your best case hope here happens with this report? I mean, you don't want it to just sit on a shelf.
It's better than being put in the circular file, don't you think? I have no control over what happens to our reports. I have no enforcement authority. When we make recommendations, we hope that the logic and the reason and the supporting evidence is sufficient to get state government, either the administration and or the legislature, to adopt and implement the recommendations we've provided. But beyond that, I mean, that's the plight of the state auditor, me and my predecessors and successors. You do the best you can, and you hope people are paying attention. But other branches of government have the power to say, thanks so much. Next.
All right. And I know I asked you this before, but I'm going to ask you again. So, what is, if people are reading this report, particularly people that have followed this story now for well over a decade, what are they going to learn in this report that they didn't know before?
Well, to be honest, you would know better than I, but I can't recall that a lot of this intra-state internal stuff has been reported.
Like what?
Well, the fact that there were no policies and procedures for the EB-5 Center. They never did that. There were no records kept of their quarterly meetings. I mean, this goes to, I mean, I don't want to be rude, but one of the takeaways is people should start paying more attention to the Agency of Commerce, which moves a lot of money, taxpayer money, out for incentive programs and a variety of things. And I've reported through my office and before about some of them. I think they could do a better job in their due diligence as, fiduciaries for taxpayers. So that's one for sure.
Is there anything they're working on now that comes to mind?
Funny you should ask. We are nearing the completion of an audit of two programs that were created using federal money from the ARPA COVID period. And they're pretty substantial. One was called CIP and the other is CRRP. And both of them are effectively efforts to give money to businesses and some nonprofits and municipalities for capital investment. And as you know, VEGI, which is the state incentive program under VEPSI, the Economic Progress Council, is intended for job creation. Well, we really don't need to incentivize job creation right now. We don't have enough people to fill the jobs we have. So for a number of years now, the agency has tried to get the legislature to create programs that would allow them to give money for capital investment by businesses without any job creation. Although I'm not aware of any evidence that there's a problem with businesses not being able to do capital investment. Because, when you do that, you're doing it only for two reasons. One, because your demand for your product or service is exceeding your capacity. So you got to build another warehouse, another manufacturing facility or whatever. Or you're aware of new equipment, for example, that will increase your productivity. And your competitors are doing it, so if you don't, you're screwed. So, but the point is, these two programs were done on the run by the legislature with COVID money. And they don't include a lot of internal controls. And we will be reporting on that in near term, within a month.
Anything else you want to mention?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this work. The people, or there's one person primarily who worked on this. Others did some quality control work for her. They spent a lot of time on this. And I think they'll be happy to have it in the rearview mirror, to be honest.
You want to mention who that is?
No, she doesn't want to be made to be the face of the EB-5 report.
That's you.
That's me.
As for the status of the green cards for permanent residency that the investors sought, Hoffer's report says as of early this year, 61% of the investors in 7 of the Jay Peak and Burke Mountain projects have been approved for their green cards. The green card status of the investors in ANC Bio is unknown, since some of them were moved to other projects outside of Vermont. That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks for listening.